Hello everyone, my name is Gareth Woodhouse, and this presentation is based on a Master's in Counselling dissertation. My dissertation explored what the current literature suggests about therapists' bias towards male victims of domestic abuse and intimate partner violence. I'll begin by sharing what inspired me to look into this area, as well as some background information, before we delve into the methods, my main findings, and what these findings can mean for counselling going forward. So to start with, why did I pick this area? Well, I came across accounts online from male survivors who shared their experiences of trying to access support from organizations such as the police, mental health services, and domestic abuse charities. A lot of them had similar experiences of being dismissed for their experiences, being misunderstood to the point of actually being seen as perpetrators, and being blamed for the actions of their abusive spouses. And this stood out to me because these are organizations that are supposed to be neutral and give the support for those that need it. Yet these men were experiencing a bias in their view. And if these organizations can be biased, potentially, then can other places of neutrality be biased as well? And as a counseling student, that made me naturally think of the therapy room. As counselors, we're expected to give a space of non-judgment where clients can come in and be their open and authentic selves, and without facing that judgment and discrimination. Yet, if bias can seep into the counseling room, not only can this affect the therapeutic relationship, but also the therapeutic outcome as well. So, with that in mind, I decided to do some preliminary research into what is actually, going on with therapist bias in this area. And I found that there was actually very little direct research that looked into this. So I felt it would be a good opportunity to create a literature review consolidating all the existing literature into one place, and be able to act as a springboard for future research to look into this area. So with that said, let's start some background information, starting first of all with what is exactly domestic abuse and intimate partner violence. Now, domestic abuse itself is an umbrella term that covers abusive behavior within domestic and family relationships. Now, we normally talk about this in terms of partners and ex-partners, but this can also cover abuse involving family members like parents with their adult children, siblings, and other relatives as well. Across the world, we have slightly different variations of domestic abuse recognized in law, but here in the UK, our definition is provided by the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021 that defines domestic abuse as abusive behavior between personally connected people aged 16 and over, taking into account provisions for under 18 as well. It also gives examples of abusive behavior, covering actions such as physical and sexual abuse, economic abuse, psychological harm, and coercive behavior, among others. And I will point out that domestic abuse is the umbrella term. When we're talking specifically about abuse between partners and ex-partners, the term intimate partner violence, or IPV, is preferred. And according to Brennan et al. 2015, IPV can also include physical and psychological aggression, coercive tactics, and stalking, among other behaviors as well. So with these definitions in mind, let's have a look to see what the landscape is when it comes to domestic abuse here in the UK, starting with female victims, as they are often seen as the main victims of domestic abuse. So to give a wider context across the world, according to the World Health Organization, roughly 1 in 3 women have experienced physical and or sexual assault or abuse by an intimate partner or ex-spouse in their lifetime, which is a staggering number. But take into account this is a worldwide view. When we take the focus closer to home here in the UK, according to the most recent figures by the Office for National Statistics, roughly 9.1% of women within the past year have experienced domestic abuse, which, to put into figures, works out about 2.2 million women in England and Wales. In comparison for male victims, according to the same figures, roughly 6.5% of males have experienced domestic abuse within the past year. And again, to put into figures, that works out about 1.5 million. Now you'll notice there's still a difference of about 700 in the numbers between female and male victims. But if you actually break the numbers down instead into the lower denominator and compare them, it actually shows a ratio of 2 to 3. Or, to put it another way, for every 3 women that experienced domestic abuse in the past year, 2 men have as well. Now, it's important to highlight this because while women do remain highly represented in the official statistics when we talk about domestic abuse, it does show then that male victimization is not something that's rare and uncommon. It's actually something fairly common, and this should be taken into account not only when we're talking about counseling practice, but the wider discourse regarding domestic abuse. And so here in the UK, what is that discourse surrounding domestic abuse? Well, domestic abuse is actually seen in a fairly unilateral one-direction path, where men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. Now, this approach has been instrumental in providing not only recognition when it comes to violence against women and girls, but also being able to shape provisions and support for those victims as well. But seeing it through this lens can also make it harder for male victimization potentially to be recognized as well. And to give an example of this, on screen now is two of the most recent campaigns for domestic abuse here in the UK, with the UK government's Enough campaign and the Greater Manchester Council Authority's #IsThisOK. As you'll notice, both of them are focused on and explicitly call out ending violence against women and girls. And when you go onto their websites, they do recognize that male victims can happen, but make a point to point out that women and girls are still highly disproportionately affected compared to male and boys, which can make things not only harder, but when you look things through this gendered assumption, it can also influence not only how abuse is actually identified, but how it's responded to as well. To give an example of this, with the wider framework of ending violence against women and girls, the Home Office a few years ago in 2022 actually submitted a paper called Supporting Male Victims, where it does talk about male victims, but it just makes a decision to actually put it within the broader violence context of violence against women and girls, rather than making a more gendered approach. And this is where I feel the focus of this review becomes important, because if male victims are not easily recognized within the dominant discourse, then it could be that they face barriers unique to their experiences and something to look into. And something to look into. So, male victims of domestic abuse and IPV can face different barriers. The fact of even recognizing their abuse as their experiences as abuse to begin with, actually being believed and taken seriously, as well as being comfortable to disclose that abuse to others, and finally being able to access appropriate support when needed. Now, I will point out that these are also barriers that many female victims present as well, and something I would like to highlight is that the focus on the study does not minimize violence against women. Rather than I take it as comparing a group whose therapeutic needs are may be overlooked, rather than making it a competition. So with that said, let's move on to the research question, which is, what does the current literature indicate about therapist bias towards male victims of domestic abuse and IPV? With the wider aim to explore the literature surrounding male victims' experiences of counselling, mental health services and help seeking, in order to consider what this may mean when it comes to therapist bias. With the background information given, let's start having a look into my method. Now, as I explained already, I decided to go with a systemic literature review in order to examine the empirical evidence that exists at the moment when it comes towards therapist bias towards male victims. I needed then to create a search strategy and how I was going to obtain my information and my data. So I decided, after comparing both Spider and Pico, to go with the Spider search strategy. I felt because the papers I was looking at was a mixture of mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative, that Spider would be a much better choice than Pico, that tends to focus, I believe, more on intervention-based studies. But using Spider then, I came up with my search terms, and after checking out a number of different databases, which you can find on the dissertation itself, but included databases such as psych articles, and then had to come up with what criteria I can use to actually use them in my study, which is where I decided to use Prisma 2020 as a way to check the eligibility of them. So to start with, here are the search terms roughly that I used when it came to my Spider strategy. Now, These are not the exact terms, you can find them in the dissertation itself, but for simplicity when it came to the presentation in space, these are the rough guidelines of what I used. Now you can see that my main focus was on male victims and survivors of domestic abuse, and I was open to all studies, but wanted to make sure that I was taking them into account when it came to counselling and help-seeking areas, as well as to look directly for therapist bias, attitudes, stereotypes, and so on. Now, something to point out is when I actually did this first of all, I actually ended up with no papers at all. And so after some consultation, I decided to actually relax the phenomenon labels and focus instead on finding male victims' experiences of counseling and help seeking, and using those experiences then to actually infer whether or not therapist bias actually happened. Once I obtained my data, I then needed to screen it to make sure which one was then eligible and what was not. As you can see on screen with this simplified Prisma flowchart, I originally had 555 records, which after removing the duplicates and doing a first stage screening by looking at the title and abstract of the study, I actually managed to narrow it down to 53 papers. With those 53 then, I did a full text analysis to see what their eligibility was towards my study, and you can see on screen what was included and what was excluded. And the end result was having 6 studies that I decided to include for this review. And on screen here are the six studies. Now you'll notice that, taking time to read it, that I made sure to point out a difference between core studies and supplementary studies. This is because when I did my eligibility and criteria checks, it actually narrowed it down to the 4 core studies seen on screen. But when I was going through them, I came across the 2 supplementary papers and thought that they would be a good opportunity to enrich the findings, because rather than being focused on male victims specifically, they actually talked about therapists working with male victims and their experiences as well, which, as I said, would have been a good opportunity to actually enrich it, and so it was used as a supplementary tool rather than being a core paper to look at. Now already the results show that there was actually limited direct evidence of therapist bias, and instead a lot more information about male experiences when it came to help seeking and gaining that support. There was some counseling specific findings, but the main thing overall is that while the therapist bias was not something that was directly measured, it actually gave more about the context in which therapist bias could occur instead. Now, something I did want to highlight in particular, as we're discussing counseling, was some of the findings in Hogan et al. 2021. As you can see on screen, out of the 26 men that had participated in the study, 11 of them had actually received counseling, and the figures showed that it was almost 50-50 about whether or not counseling was helpful or not. And this was something I felt was of importance, because not only does it show that counseling was not something that was automatically beneficial, it showed that what actually mattered was the quality of the therapeutic response. And the men who had described counseling positively in the study emphasized aspects such as the space for non-judgment, having the actual belief and being believed about their experiences, as well as having that confidentiality and that space to talk. Now moving on to the next stage, once I got my papers and I read through them, I was able to find 5 counseling themes identified across all 6 studies. Now, as you can see on screen, they are a mixture of internal barriers, such as shame and masculinity expectations, delaying disclosure, as well as being able to identify their experiences as abuse to begin with, as well as external factors as well. That fear of being not only disbelieved, but actually being seen perhaps as a perpetrator, combined with the fact of not having a lack of actual support pathways for male victims to actually gain the help they need. And what this actually finds, I think, is that it raises an important question. What does it actually suggest when we're talking about therapist bias? Well, the point is that therapist bias is not something that's been clearly established, as already mentioned, as a clearly studied empirical phenomenon. Instead, the findings suggest that bias can be plausible in situations where male victimization is poorly recognized, as well as female perpetrated abuse. That masculinity can shape assumptions about victimhood from not only from the clients but from the counselors as well, and that male clients are very reluctant to actually openly admit about being abused, and may instead do it indirectly or even hesitantly as well. And one of the key things then, therefore, is that bias may not be something overt, but actually be something subtle instead, and not just be a simple picture of openly hostile therapists, although there are exceptions. There's a particular paper that came to mind called From Harris et al. 2025, where one of the participants shared their experiences of going to a psychologist. And I'll quote, "I spoke to one psychologist and she stood up in front of me and shouted at me, 'Men can't be victims of abuse, only women are.' She basically made assumptions about it, and she's saying that men like you try to manipulate this situation. You're the abusers." Which, as a counsellor, made me cringe to hear someone act in that way. But overall, it's not that a case of being openly hostile, but instead that possible bias can appear in more subtle ways instead. Through elements such as surprise, being misrecognized, showing that having gendered assumptions and limited awareness of actual IPV and how it can affect both genders, as well as the fact of having assumptions about how male victims should present. There was a particular mention about this in Hook et al., I believe. Then they discussed, Harris, Harris 2016, that actually had this idea where some of the male therapists expected higher standards from their male victims of domestic abuse, and actually to expect a more macho role for them and being less sensitive. And then finally, a key interpretation perhaps is that therapist bias is something that could be implicit, relational, and shaped by wider cultural assumptions. Something that is actually supported by related research that have looked into racial experiences when it comes to therapy as well, and their experiences of bias. Perhaps the most important thing, though, to take into account is the recognition and validation of therapy. What the studies have shown is that the strongest implications is that male victims actually valued being believed, as well as having a space to be able to be not judged and to be able to speak confidentially. And also having that help to even recognize that the relationship they were in was abusive to begin with. As well as having people that actually understood not only about intimate partner violence, but also what its effects were on people as well. And in many places, therapy could be the first place where not only abuse is something that's named, but also recognized and legitimized for their experiences too. But it will be pointed out that it will be too simple just to locate the issue among individual therapists. The wider context of surfaces and the social assumptions can matter as well. So, for example, their access to support as a male victim can also be shaped by not only those internal barriers when it comes to shame and denial, which studies such as Lazova and Dim suggested that counseling is something that men will reluctantly perhaps enter to later in life after trying different methods, such as trying to cope and withdrawing from situations instead. But also those external factors cropping up again, those fears of being misidentified as a perpetrator, of being disbelieved for their experiences and judged because of it. There's also that returning theme of the limited visibility of male victim services, such as we've seen already with the Enough and #IsThisOK campaigns. And the fact that screening and referral pathways may not be something that male victims be able to experience properly and be a suitable fit for them as well. So what does this mean for counseling practice going forward? Well, my review suggests that ultimately counselors should be counselors. While we can take into account those more male unique experiences perhaps of recognizing masculinity and the assumptions about it, as well as internal shame about being possible barriers of disclosure, then we should also do what we normally would do. Listen out for those indirect and partial disclosures of abuse, Remain to alert about psychological and coercive control when we're talking to our clients. And not only that, but for ourselves, avoiding to assume that gender can be a factor when it comes to victimhood and perpetration, and being able to use supervision as we're meant to reflect on these gendered assumptions. As for future research into this area, it could be of benefit to explore how male victims' experiences with counsellors in greater depth rather than the ability I was able to do so in this review, as well as being able to look at things such as whether screening tools and referral pathways actually recognize male victimization in the first place, and how these can be improved, as well as into looking at a more diverse group of male victims, such as those from the LGBTQ+ community, as well as different racial and cultural backgrounds as well. And finally, as a take-home message, male victims of domestic abuse and IPV can enter counselling carrying burdens that are unique to their experiences. And while that evidence doesn't show that there is widespread therapist bias, it can show that counsellors need to be reminded of these assumptions and create a space like we would for any client where victimization be recognized, named, and safely explored. And as a final point, as counselors, we should not assume gender tells them who can be a victim, who can be harmed, and who can have the support needed. In fact, anyone can be a victim, anyone can be harmed, and anyone can need support. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I will let the videos continue so you can check out the references that have been referred to throughout the presentation. Otherwise, thank you again for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.